Good evening. I'm Avraham Nitzan, the director of the Mortimer and Raymond Institute of Advanced Studies here in Tel Aviv University, and I'm happy to... How about now? I'm happy to open yet another lecture by Bernard Lewis. One of the things that I like about being the director of this institute is that this is an occasion when I introduce a speaker, a speaker from what we call the west side of campus, which is our humanities and social studies in Tel Aviv University. This gives me the opportunity to reflect a little bit on the two cultures, the concept that was introduced by C.P. Snow at the beginning of the previous century. These two cultures, humanities on one side and sciences on the other, in our institutes. This is my opportunity as a representative of the east side of campus to do this on such occasions. A year or two ago, we sat at dinner after one of Bernard's lectures, and I sat across the table from Martin Kremer, who is a colleague from the west side of campus and a former student of Bernard Lewis. And the discussion turned to discussing history, the study of history, and what is the position of history on the line that connects science and arts. From one side, history relies on understanding and collecting, getting to know the facts, and from this point of view, this is science. On the other hand, this has also to do with interpreting these facts and deducing some future trends from these facts, and there is a lot of personal input and possibly also bias. So the question of how much study of history is science and how much the interpreting part of history is the art of the historian artist is, in my opinion, a fascinating question. I know that I'm stepping on dangerous grounds here, where half a century ago, historians of science and sociologists tried to advance the notion that science also depends on the subjective input and the sociological background of the scientist. This actually gave rise to what became known in the previous century as the science wars, because scientists really fiercely objected to this idea that their profession has anything to do with subjective judgments. So I have no intention to open a new front in this war tonight. Let me focus on what is clearly true in both cultures, that a prerequisite to forming an opinion and making interpretation is familiarity and understanding of the facts. One cannot overestimate this also when it comes to decision-making in the political world. I remember a comment that Bernard Lewis himself made in an interview to an Israeli newspaper a few years ago, that one reason why the Camp David negotiations between Barak and Arafat failed because they did not understand each other's culture and biases. Bernard Lewis has over many years played a decisive role in promoting such familiarity and understanding of Muslim culture and society in the Western world, and this is also what he has done for us here in Tel Aviv University in many lectures. He is a graduate of the University of London and taught for many years in Princeton University. He is now the emeritus professor of Near Eastern Studies. More importantly, for us, for many years now, actually nearly a quarter of a century, he is a repeated visitor to Tel Aviv University a fellow of our Institute of Advanced Studies, and he was sharing with us his wisdom and insight on history of the Middle East, history of Jews in the Middle East and in Europe. 2 weeks from now, he will talk to us on choices for the Middle East. Today, the subject of his talk is periodization of history. Please, Bernard Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. May I begin by saying how delighted I am to be here once again on my nth visit and to face this welcoming audience. I can feel the welcome oozing from you. Let me turn now to my topic, which is what you want to hear about. What? Isn't it? Oh, well. Sorry, can you hear me now? I don't have to start again, do I? No. Thank you. My subject this evening is the periodization of history. And I would like to begin by telling you 2 stories from a very remote past. Right. 2 stories from a very remote past when I was a young lecturer in the University of London, just beginning to learn my profession. On one occasion, I was asked by the School of Oriental and African Studies, in which I was teaching, to sit on the committee which interviewed applicants for undergraduate places. These were people who were in the last year of high school and were applying for a place in the university. And this committee had the job of interviewing the various applicants and then making not a decision, but a recommendation on which should be accepted. One of the applicants was a young lady, presumably about 18 years old, from a school on the Welsh border, who said that she wanted to come in order to study Chinese history. This seemed a somewhat improbable aspiration. And we asked her why, and she said as long as she could remember, she had been fascinated by China. And she had read every book she could lay her hands upon about China, Chinese history, Chinese culture. And now that she was going to university, her dearest wish was to learn Chinese in order to study Chinese history more closely. Well, my colleagues who knew more about Chinese things than I did asked her various appropriate questions. When it was my turn to ask, I asked a sort of normal historian's question. I said, you're very interested in Chinese history. Is your interest mainly in ancient or medieval or modern history? And this young lady looked at me for a while, hesitated, and then said, sir, she said, if you can tell me what these words mean in relation to Chinese history, I will try to answer your question. This was a very intelligent and also a very courageous answer. We accepted her, of course, enthusiastically, but she didn't come. I don't know why. She may have had a better offer elsewhere, or perhaps she didn't want to come to a place where the professors asked such stupid questions. My second story, also from the same period, relates to a request I received from a very distinguished Oxford professor, Sir Maurice Powick, to participate in a project in which he was working. He was at that time one of the best-known medieval historians in England, a very distinguished scholar in the field of medieval history. And I was surprised to learn that he occupied the Regius Chair of Modern History at Oxford University. The Regius Chair at Oxford and Cambridge is a chair established by the Crown. And I was a little puzzled. I mean, he's the Regius Professor of Modern History, but he's a medievalist. So I asked a friend in Oxford how this could happen. And I was told with a rather sort of contemptuous smile that at Oxford, modern history begins with the fall of Rome. These 2 true stories are by way of introduction They created a sort of awareness, even an alertness, which I might otherwise have lacked. This terminology, ancient, medieval, modern, is now used almost universally, whether appropriate or not. Those of you who are students of the history of Islam will certainly be aware of a famous book called Medieval Islam, written by one of the most distinguished scholars in the field. It's an excellent book, still many years after its original publication, an invaluable resource for any student of Muslim history. But the title is an absurdity. What it means is not medieval Islam. It means that period of Islamic history which corresponds to the medieval period in European history. This classification, ancient, medieval, modern, is European. It was invented by Europeans in Europe to classify the different phases of European history. And like so many other things from Europe, it was either adopted by or imposed upon the rest of the world, whether appropriate or not. Now, even for Europe, the term medieval is comparatively recent. How recent, I didn't realize until these incidents provoked me to looking into the matter more closely. For a very long time, history was divided, and I'm still speaking now of Europe, history was divided into ancient and modern. And as my friends at Oxford told me, modern history began with the fall of Rome. The two Regius professorships of modern history at Oxford and Cambridge were founded in the year 1724. And both of them were concerned almost exclusively with medieval history, what we would now call medieval history. That's to say modern in the sense that it was post-Roman. The term medieval is comparatively recent. The very notion of some sort of interval between ancient and modern is comparatively recent. For a long time, as I said, it was simply ancient and modern. Now, the division between ancient and modern has varied somewhat. Normally, it was the fall of Rome, but historians have differed as to how precisely to date the fall of Rome. It wasn't a single action, it was a process, and different historians have rather arbitrarily chosen different dates, but mainly from the late 4th into the early 5th century. Either the fall of Rome or the advent of Christianity, which is in another sense the beginning of the modern era, and indeed the beginning of the calendar, which is still used. A calendar which was so long known as AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord, obviously a Christian designation. Nowadays, that is no longer politically correct, and AD has been replaced by CE, the Common Era. That makes it possible for Jews and Muslims to use it without embarrassment. This era was used backwards as well as forwards, so that we had BC, which meant before Christ, but has now become BCE, before the Common Era. Let me come now to the emergence of the notion medieval. The English language, we are fortunate in having dictionaries which date fairly precisely the earliest recorded use of a word. The earliest recorded use in English of the word medieval is 1827. The whole of the medieval period, they were totally unaware of being medieval. The notion of medieval seems to have developed, I say seems to because it's not totally certain, but very likely, seems to have developed in Italy among the humanists at the early stages of the Renaissance as they contemplated the glorious ruins of Rome all around them, considered the situation which had followed, and saw the beginnings of a new dawn of civilization of which they themselves were the creators. Petrarch, the great Italian poet, in the 1330s, invented a new term, the Dark Ages, a term which has since passed into common usage. The Dark Ages meaning the end of civilization represented by Greece and Rome, a period of barbarism and ignorance. He dated it approximately from the late 5th century to about the year 1000. Another Italian humanist, Flavio Biondi, about a century later, took the matter a step further and invented another new term, the Middle Ages. But as I remarked earlier, its general acceptance and use, and more particularly the adjective medieval, didn't come till much later. European scholars were engaged in extensive research on history, not only forwards but even backwards into an increasingly remote past, so remote that they developed a new periodization by tools and weapons: Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. And with increasing knowledge, with increasing documentation in the form of archaeological remnants, they subdivided, so that the Stone Age was subdivided into the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, the New Stone Age, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. Nowadays, historians have another problem, and that is that the modern history is getting longer and longer. This creates another problem of, shall we say, classification and designation. Even if we give up the idea that modern history starts with the fall of Rome and just started from the end of the Middle Ages, wherever that may be, it's still a long period and getting longer every day. Some historians have invented terms like early modern, distinguish between early modern and modern. Others have taken the more dangerous step of using the term contemporary, so that modern history means yesterday and contemporary history means today. But what about tomorrow, which becomes today in a very short time? In German, they use the terms Neuzeit for the modern period, the new time, and then when that was getting a bit stale, they invented the term Neueste Zeit, the newest time. Again, what comes next? Well, we've heard, of course, of postmodern, but that has a rather different connotation. I hope some of you will at least live to see what is the next phase. That ancient medieval modern is not the only periodization. There have been a number of others, which I want to look at briefly. One of them is, of course, by the means of production and the ownership of the means of production. In other words, the Marxist approach, dividing history into the eras of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. There's a fascinating literature from the Soviet Union in the immediate pre-war period, a group of Soviet Orientalists, specialists in Arab, Persian, Turkish, and more generally Islamic history, trying to periodize Islamic history according to the only system of periodization that was permitted in the Soviet Union, namely the Marxist one. So, which is the slave society? Which is the bourgeois society? You have arguments as to whether the Quran is a slave-owning document or a feudal document, and a lot more. To us, this seems nonsensical and absurd, but our own practice of using the West European terminology is perhaps more sophisticatedly absurd. Another periodization that is very commonly used nowadays and has formed the basis of several popular philosophers of history is what you might call the biological metaphor. The history of civilization begins with conception and grows through infancy, childhood, adolescence, maturity, including mating and procreation, and ends with decay and death. Many histories in the 20th century, and starting even in the late 19th century, were written on this basic classification. This raises interesting questions about what is there before and what comes after. The term barbarism is generally used to indicate something other than civilization. But there is, of course, a very interesting difference between the barbarians who are going up towards civilization and the barbarians who are coming down from a decayed civilization. I think it's a difference which is of particular relevance to our time. Don't ask me to elaborate on that. Sometimes historians have tried to classify history, periodize history, I should say, on the basis of some major event. One example I've already given you, the fall of Rome. Another example, the rise of Christianity. Sometimes more precise dates than that are used. For a long time, for example, the date 1453 was seen as extraordinarily significant. This was the date when the Christian city of Constantinople was captured by the Muslim Ottoman Turks. This was the last Christian stronghold in the East, and its capture by the Turks completed a process which had been going on for centuries. At one time, it was quite common to regard this as the end of the Middle Ages, the starting point of the modern era, though this seems to me to be a rather exaggerated interpretation of that event. Another popular year with the periodizers is 1492, which combines a number of different events, all very significant in their way. I suppose the best known is the discovery of America. Another is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Another, usually forgotten except among those concerned, is the completion of the reconquest of Spain. Earlier in that same year, 1492, the Christians conquered the last Muslim stronghold on Spanish soil, the city of Granada. The completion of what is known in Spanish history as the Reconquista. The expulsion of the Jews, obviously a major event in Jewish history, and from the point of view of the historian of the Jews, certainly a crucial event. It's also important in another respect. What we often tend to overlook is that the expulsion of the Jews in 1492 was what you might call a dry run for the bigger and more important task of expelling the Muslims. The Muslims in reconquered Spain were far more numerous than the Jews. Expelling them, giving them the choice of baptism or death, was obviously a much more difficult operation than for the Jews. The expulsion of the Jews, I think, could be seen as a pilot project. And the expulsion of the Muslims came in the early years of the 16th century in phases for different parts. But in that sense, too, it was the beginning of a new era. Another event of 1492, a crucial event, is usually forgotten, but one to which a French historian recently drew attention. That is the publication of a book called Grammatica Castellana, Castilian Grammar, by a Spanish scholar called Antonio de Nebrija. What makes that important is that this was the first time that a grammar had been compiled of a European vernacular. Until then, the situation in Europe was rather similar to the situation in the Arab world today. They use a dead language for all written purposes and regarded the languages which they spoke as mere dialects, not worthy of serious attention. This was the first time that a scholar produced a grammar, correct usage of what until then had been a dialect. It was the first of many and marks the beginning of the, how shall I put it, the acceptance of Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, and other languages, replacing medieval Latin, which sank into a well-deserved oblivion. If we compare what happened there in Europe with what has happened and is still happening in the Arab world, which confronts a similar problem. I think that is very enlightening. Another date often adduced is 1789, the French Revolution, which many see as the starting point of modern history, not only in France, but all over the world. I see it simply as a slightly delayed centennial of the English Revolution of 1688. But I may be prejudiced in this. A more recent turning point, I think you will agree, is 1948. And what I'm thinking of is, of course, the establishment of the State of Israel. A crucial date in the history of the Jews, quite obviously, but also a crucial date in the history of the region, and more broadly, all other parts of the world that are affected by or involved in this region. It was, for the Jews, a glorious victory, for the Arabs, a humiliating defeat. And the memory of those events still remains very powerful on both sides, with their diametrically opposite effects. Some historians have used rather more limited periodizations, choosing a much shorter period for the purpose of study. One such is a reign. We talk about the Elizabethan period, for example. And I think one may say it is a genuine period, as historians use that term. We talk about the Victorian period. And I was curious to discover, I was surprised rather, to discover that the term Victorian is also extensively used in the United States, though that country was never part of the realm of Queen Victoria. Nevertheless, it has become an accepted term. I'm still not quite sure why. Perhaps you can enlighten me. Another dynastic designation, obviously, is Napoleonic, a rather different category. I find it interesting that the only two reigns in England which have given a name, generally accepted name to a period, are both women, Elizabethan and Victorian. One does use the word Georgian, but it lacks precision, nor does it have quite the same impact as those others. Sometimes historians have chosen a limited time with distinctive features. And here I will offer you one outstanding example, a book by the British historian Arthur Marwick on the 1960s. A short period, but one with a quite remarkable sequence of major events. The Kennedy presidency and assassination, the man on the moon, the birth control pill with its social and cultural consequences, the student revolution, the Vietnam problem, and so on and so forth. Oh, and the Beatles, of course. That also raises another interesting question relevant to periodization. Where do you begin and where do you end? I've talked of periodization in terms of a year, but Marwick, in his history of the 60s, points out quite accurately, I don't think one can contest it. He says that to write the history of the 60s, you must begin in the late 50s, and you can't stop until you're well into the early 70s. I think once stated, obvious, but, well, let me turn now to my main theme, and that is Middle Eastern history. All that I've said so far is by way of preliminary or preparation. The Middle East is the region of the most ancient civilizations known to mankind. But its peoples underwent a series of cataclysmic changes through conquest and domination. The Middle East was or conversion. The Middle East was Hellenized, it was Romanized, in a different way it was Christianized, and then most comprehensively by conquest and conversion, it was Islamized. That beginning very definitely a new and different era. One indication of the change is the fate of the languages. These were ancient written languages in the Middle East. But with one exception, and to this audience I don't need to say which, with one exception, the languages of the ancient Middle East were all totally forgotten. They were dead and forgotten. The languages were unknown, the scripts were unknown, and replaced by later forms, which in turn were also replaced. Aramaic came to be spoken in most of what is now known as the Fertile Crescent. Coptic, a later form of the ancient Egyptian language, came to be dominant in Egypt. But with the Arab conquest, these two died out. Coptic and Aramaic were limited to the rituals of their churches, and Aramaic to a few villages where it is still, a dialect of Aramaic is still spoken. If you go on the main road north from Damascus, about, if I remember rightly, about 30 miles, you take a turn to the left, and you come to a valley called Ma'lula, where there are 3 villages where they still speak Aramaic, the same dialect of Aramaic as was spoken by Jesus and his contemporaries. There is one partial exception to this change, and that is the Persians. The Persians did not adopt the Arabic language. They retained their own language, but in a very basic form. They had lost the old script, and therefore with it they had lost their ancient identity and memory. Only the Jews, and the Jews alone, retained their language, their memory, and their identity. Unfortunately, that doesn't help us very much, because the Jews stopped writing history. After the end of the biblical period, the Jews seem to have lost interest in history. Indeed, Maimonides even says in 2 different places in his writings that history is a waste of time. It serves no purpose, either for the mind or for the body. He says it's the sort of thing that the Goyim do. It's not too difficult to see why. History needs a patron, it needs a public. The Jews of the diaspora had neither. And so that between the end of the ancient Jewish state and the emergence of the new curiosity of the Renaissance, there is, strange as it may seem, no Jewish historiography. There's a lot of history, a lot happening, and a lot of, how shall I put it, historical remnants, sources, documents, inscriptions, manuscripts, all sorts of things. But nobody was actually writing history, because there was no reason to do so. In contrast, Islamic historiography, from the very beginning, is quite extraordinarily rich, detailed, and sophisticated. It has been calculated that from the advent of Islam until the end of the Middle Ages, say roughly the 15th century, the bulk of historical writings in Arabic alone in this pre-modern period is more extensive than the entire Western output in Latin, in Greek, and in all the European vernaculars. As another example of the historical mindedness of Islam, I would point to the situation in India. India is a country of very ancient civilization, going back many centuries, if not millennia, before the advent of Islam. But we know nothing about the history of ancient India, because the Hindus did not regard it as important. History was seen as irrelevant, unimportant. They would have agreed with Maimonides that it was a waste of time. The recorded history of India begins with the Arab-Muslim conquest. Our knowledge of what happened before that has been laboriously put together from historical remnants, documents, inscriptions, and the like. Why? Why were Muslims so concerned with history? Why did it matter so much to them? Because for the Muslim, history is the record of the working out of God's plan for mankind. Everything that happens is ordained and decreed by God. Let me interject for a moment to say this does not mean a complete belief in predestination. The way it was put by one Muslim divine is, yes, the Quran says nothing shall befall us save what God has written for us. The text is perfectly clear. لَنْ يُصِيبَنَا إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا. But, as a medieval Muslim philosopher says, history is not a game of chess. It's a game of backgammon. We don't have complete freedom of choice. Fate, God, destiny determines the throw of the dice. But within the throw of the dice, we still have some choices. We can still win or lose the game. I think that's a very instructive metaphor. History is important, as I say, because it represents the record of God's purpose for mankind. It follows, therefore, that the only history that matters is Muslim history. That history, which is not enlightened by the Quran and by Islam, is of no value. That means two things: history before Islam, which is called Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, or history outside Islam, the lands of the unbelievers. So you get some quite remarkable phenomena resulting from that. On the one hand, as I said, there is an enormously rich historiographic literature starting from the time of the Prophet himself, with some background about the earlier period. There are in the Quran, in the biography, in the traditions, there are some allusions to an earlier past, mainly biblical allusions, which require some explanation. So there is some attention, but minimal attention to the pre-Islamic past. Otherwise, history of the Middle East before Islam was obliterated and forgotten. So in the region with the oldest, longest history in the world, all the old languages and scripts were forgotten, the monuments and the writings destroyed or disregarded. In Egypt, for example, Pharaoh was known only in the Quranic version, which is much the same as in the biblical version. And this has sometimes given rise in modern Egypt to agonizing dilemmas. At the time of the 73 war, or possibly one of the earlier ones, I'm not sure, there's an Egyptian woman writer tackled the Quranic version of the Exodus story now. In the Quranic version of the Exodus story, Pharaoh is the bad guy and the Jews, the children of Israel, are God's people. In other words, it's much the same as the biblical version. And that somehow seemed inappropriate to modern Egypt. And she suggested, obviously very cautiously and carefully, that maybe the Quran had got it wrong, and that one should take the side of Pharaoh rather than of the Banu Israel. This did not have much support. Even into modern times, we remember when Sadat was murdered, the leader of the group that murdered him proclaimed proudly, "I have killed Pharaoh." Obviously, he didn't mean that Sadat was a great and glorious Egyptian leader. He was talking about Pharaoh as the personification of evil, as the enemy of God's people. And the fact that God's people in that particular story happened to be the Israelites and didn't bother him. It did bother a number of others. The revival of interest in the ancient past came very slowly, and in its early stages was due entirely to foreigners. The recovery of the lost past in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, was the work of that terrible breed of people known as the Orientalists. Mostly European, later some American. It was their work entirely which made it possible to discover, to decipher, to interpret, to reconstruct the languages and recover the long-lost history of ancient Egypt. It wasn't until 1868 that for the first time an Egyptian scholar, a sheikh from Al-Azhar who spent some years in Paris, wrote a history of Egypt which ended where all the previous histories of Egypt had begun, namely with the Arab conquest. This was something new and entirely new. And we find a similar situation in most of the other countries of the Middle East. When the Persians, who, unlike the peoples of Iraq and Syria and Egypt, had preserved a form of their language and had preserved a certain identity, when they wanted to do something about their history, there was nothing available to them. They could no longer read the old Persian language, and there was nothing available to them in Arabic. All that they had was myths and legends. The genuine history of pre-Islamic Persia was totally lost and forgotten until it was recovered, deciphered, and brought to them by Western scholars. Cyrus, for example, the great Persian hero, was totally unknown in Iran until modern times, when they read about him in English and French. I mentioned the lack of interest in previous history. There is an almost equal, not quite equal, but almost equal lack of interest in external history. The Middle East, after all, was between regions of ancient civilization. They had extensive dealings with India and with China, commercial, cultural, and many other things. But with rare exceptions, we don't find the slightest interest in the history of China or of India. There is one book on India which is regarded as remarkable, indeed unique. None, as far as I am aware, about China. China was seen as a source of valuable knowledge. Seek wisdom even in China, the Prophet is quoted as saying. But Chinese history, no, of no interest. A little more interest in the history of Christendom. In Christendom, they recognized a cognate civilization. China and India were totally alien. Christendom was a civilization inspired by a religion, in some respects similar, in other respects, of course, different from their own, but recognizable for a Muslim even in the Middle Ages. It was the kind of religion which he might not share but could understand. And also he saw in Christendom a rival. Christians and Muslims share an attribute which, as far as I know, does not appear in any other religion. The belief that their message from God is not only true, all religions believe that, but exclusive. That they are the fortunate recipients of God's final message to mankind. Join them and be saved, refuse and be damned. This was the shared perception. And they understood each other perfectly well, and they could really argue meaningfully. In the Middle Ages even, we find this happening in Spain, where Christians and Muslims live side by side. If a Christian said to a Muslim, or a Muslim said to a Christian, "You are an infidel and you will burn in hell," each understood exactly what the other meant, because they both meant exactly the same thing. A statement of that sort would have been meaningless to a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Confucian. There was, therefore, rather more interest in Christendom, with which they had such very extensive contacts, all the way from the Levant to Spain and even into France and Italy. But, nevertheless, the total amount written on Christian history, on European history, is absolutely minimal. We find, for example, that they have practically nothing to say about the Byzantine Empire, their next-door neighbor for many centuries. One would have thought that even for practical, political, and military reasons they would be interested, but no. we find that they have very little to say about the Reformation, which would have been extremely important to the Ottoman Turks, since the quarrels between Protestants and Catholics gave them a weapon which they could and did use very effectively. The 30 Years' War in Germany, you would think that that would matter to them. It's just beyond their frontier, happening over a long period of time, of immediate and vital concern to the Ottoman government. The Ottomans had very full, very detailed historical writings, but the 30 Years' War, to the best of my recollection, gets about a page and a half. There were some attempts at Western history, but very little. The first, and in many ways the most significant exception, is an early 14th century historian in Persia called Rashid ad-Din. He was a Jewish convert to Islam working for a Mongol ruler. So in two respects, he's hardly typical of Islamic historiography. He was a physician and advisor. Historian and physician professions very frequently combined in the Middle Ages. He worked for a Mongol ruler, as I said, and either of his own initiative or at the request of that ruler, he started to do a universal history, the first such to my knowledge, a history which was to include all known civilizations. He got information from Chinese sources about Chinese history, in which the Mongols were naturally interested. He had material on Indian history, where there was already a substantial Muslim community. And more relevant from our present point of view, he compiled the first narrative of European history in a Muslim language. History of the Franks, he calls it. And it was based on a medieval European chronicle, which he was able to get translated for his use. We find a few more attempts of this kind in the Ottoman period. Some Ottoman historians, they were after all invading Europe. They occupied a large part of southeastern Europe. They were conducting maritime attacks in Western Europe, even as far away as the British Isles and Iceland and Madeira. Nevertheless, the lack of interest in what was going on in Europe is staggering. There were a few exceptions. We find historians who managed to get translations of European chronicles. But what is striking is not only the rarity of such works, but the total lack of interest in them. We have mentions of them. Sometimes we have one fragmentary manuscript which survives in Leipzig or Cambridge because it was picked up by some Western traveler. And there was a total lack of interest at home. In other words, there was no Occidentalism compared with the Orientalism which flourished in Christian Europe. Interest did not begin until the 19th century. Now, let me come back to my theme of periodization. How did Muslim historians periodize and subdivide? In the Western world, the usual practice was by kingdoms, a kingdom and country, and kingdoms being subdivided by dynasties and interrupted by conquests. Muslim historians usually classified by dynasties and capitals. And I stress, capital, not countries, not nations, cities. So you have, for example, phase 1, the patriarchal caliphate ruling from Medina. Phase 2, the Umayyad caliphs ruling from Damascus. Phase 3, the Abbasid caliphs reigning in Baghdad, and so on. It is remarkable that we simply do not find country histories at all. We find histories of cities, we find histories of dynasties. And of course, most of all, we find what they would call universal history, namely the history of the Islamic world as such, but not of countries. Indeed, it's often rather difficult to find names of countries. If you look at the present-day map of the world, starting in the west of the Islamic world, there's no word in Arabic for either Algeria or Tunisia. The word they use means Algiers or Tunis. They use the name of the chief city for the country. And the name Libya was unknown in the Muslim world until the Italians exhumed it from ancient Rome and imposed it on their colony. In Egypt, more often than not, they use the same word, Misr, for Cairo and for Egypt. Sham, the same word for Damascus and for Syria. The name Syria is, again, exhumed from a much earlier period in modern times and is based on a Greek version of an ancient Syrian name. The country as such, perhaps most striking of all, there is no word in Arabic for Arabia. Now, that is not because Arabic is a poor language. Arabic is a remarkably rich language. But if you want to talk about Arabia, you have to call it the land of the Arabs, or the peninsula of the Arabs, or the Arabian Peninsula, or the Arabian Kingdom. In other words, you have Arabian as an adjective, and you have Arabs as a noun, but you don't have a word which can simply be translated as Arabia. In Turkey, the name Türkiye was first adopted in Turkey by the Republic. It was a European name for Turkey. It was a European practice. You have France, which is inhabited by Frenchmen who speak French, and Germany that is inhabited by Germans who speak German, and so on. But that didn't apply in the Middle East. And the idea of Turkey as a country called Turkey inhabited by Turks who speak Turkish was entirely new, and that was an important part of the Kemalist revolution. In other parts of the Islamic world, it hasn't happened yet. And in this, again, there is a very strong contrast with Western historiography. Let me come now to the present, and for the time being, final phase in the periodization of Middle Eastern history by Middle Easterners. And here I will draw your attention to the writings and utterances of Osama bin Laden. In many ways, one of the leading figures in the Islamic world, whether we like it or not. For him, the basic fact of history for many centuries past is the global conflict between Islam and Christendom. And as he presents it, and he has done this in a number of his writings, there have been ups and downs, sometimes Islam advancing, sometimes Islam retreating. On both sides, various leaders, various dynasties ruling from various capitals, just as the Muslims had their caliphates in Medina and Damascus, in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Istanbul, so too the Christians had their various emperors ruling in various capitals. The lowest point of Muslim defeat and humiliation was 1918, when, as he points out, the last of the great Muslim empires, that of the Ottomans, was defeated and destroyed. Its territories partitioned among the victorious Christian allies. Its ruler deposed, and not long after that, even the remnant taken over by a secularist, anti-Muslim Turkish movement, abolishing the caliphate and sending the last caliph into exile. And for Osama bin Laden and his followers, this was the final, ultimate humiliation of Islam, when almost the whole of the Islamic world was under foreign rule, divided chiefly between the three great empires of Britain, France, and Russia, but with significant parts also held by Italy, Holland, and others. The beginning of the resurgence, as he sees it, and again I'm quoting Osama bin Laden, is after the Second World War, after 1945, when the British and the French empires collapse and their former territories become more or less independent, albeit not under the kind of regimes that he would like, but nevertheless no longer under infidel rule. This is also the period when new powers are emerging, the Soviet Union and the United States. What he sees as the two new superpowers, between them sharing control of the world of the infidels and dividing it between them, dividing or disputing it, I should say, between them. As he sees it, and again, this comes again and again in his writings, in this final phase, and he insists that it is a final phase, the world of Islam confronts two rival powers in the world of the infidels. In the war in Afghanistan, he says, we destroyed and defeated and destroyed one of them, the Soviet Union. Most Americans and other Westerners see that as a victory for the United States, or more specifically for the policies of President Reagan. For Osama bin Laden and his followers, it was nothing of the kind. It was a victory of the Muslim Mujahideen, and as he says again and again, he says, we have now defeated and destroyed the more deadly and the more dangerous of the two infidel superpowers. There remains only the weak and pampered and effeminate Americans. They will be easy to deal with, and then will come the end of time and the end of history. Well, he has been rather disappointed by his results since then, but he and his followers are continuing the struggle. And I will stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lewis, and I'm sure we have time for some questions. Yes, please.
Could you speak louder or use a microphone? The end of history. What? No, I don't mean his end of history. I mean Ahmadinejad's end of history. Yes. There is in Islam, as in Christianity and in Judaism, an apocalyptic scenario for the end of time, for a final struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, variously defined as Antichrist, as Gog and Magog, in Islam as Dajjal, and so on. There is an important trend in Iran particularly, but with followers elsewhere, who believe that period has now begun, that we are now engaged in the final apocalyptic struggle, the struggle of God's chosen envoy, the Mahdi, against the forces of evil. And this is an extremely dangerous mindset because it has serious consequences. In the Cold War, both sides had nuclear weapons, but neither side used them because they were prevented by what was known as MAD, mutual assured destruction. With an apocalyptic mindset, mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. And I think we should be well aware and conscious of this danger. Fortunately, Ahmadinejad seems to be losing ground in Iran. It seems that not all Iranians share his apocalyptic mindset, but it still remains a very dangerous situation.
Yes, please.
You measure history in terms of scientific achievement.
Yes, that is one of a number of things which I didn't include. I mentioned tools in antiquity. But yes, I think one can make a case for a periodization by scientific achievement, particularly those with immediate economic effects. Developments in communication, for example, the adoption of printing. But here are very interesting differences between the Islamic world and the West. In the earlier stages, in what you might call the golden age of Islam, they accepted new techniques and new ideas very willingly. They accepted paper from China, for example. Paper was unknown in the Middle East. It was first manufactured in China, was imported from China. And they took to it and made very extensive use of it. And it made a major part in the cultural development of the time. It also was important for economic development. Imagine trying to keep your business accounts on papyrus or on clay tablets. But later, they rejected printing, which also came from China and the Far East. That they simply refused. Printing was brought again by the Jews who came from Spain in 1492. They asked permission to bring their printing presses with them when they went to Turkey. They were welcomed in Turkey, but they were told, yes, you can print, but you must not print in the Arabic script, only in your own script. Printing was seen as somehow, how should I put it, blasphemous. One suspects that the Guild of Calligraphers may have had something to do with this too. But you find changes in attitude. Take, for example, the circulation of the blood, a major discovery in medicine. Well, it's usually attributed to, I forget his name. Sorry? Yes, thank you. But actually it comes much earlier. We have a medieval physician in Baghdad who actually wrote a book in Arabic in which he describes it, but it had no effect and no impact. Technological, scientific changes can be very important, but they have to have the right atmosphere in which to be accepted and to have impact. If you look at the major developments in our own time, in the field of communication especially, travel, manufacture and so on, yes, I would agree, the impact is enormous. And that makes the rejection of these the more remarkable in other societies.
Two more questions, please.
Professor, with regard to the ongoing Islamic indifference to history,
The ongoing?
the Islamic indifference to history within and without itself, would you say it's more a function of religious certainty or a one could buy
No.
That being the case, what are the implications for here and now?
No, I did not say they are indifferent to history. On the contrary, they are very interested in history. At all stages and in all Islamic societies, you find an enormous attention to history and a very voluminous writing of history. What they are not interested in is other people's history. They are not interested in the meaningless gyrations of pagans and barbarians.
Yes, last question.
Thank you so much for that most interesting talk, sir.
Okay.
May I ask you this? With regard to the periodization by language, could you comment on that?
Yes, periodization by language. Yes, that is certainly a possibility. I did allude to it in speaking of the adoption of vernaculars in Europe, which marks a very important change. And one finds it elsewhere too. In the world conquered by the Arabs, for a long time, Arabic was the sole language which could be used in government, commerce, culture, and so on. Then gradually the conquered peoples began to re-emerge with their own languages in a new Islamized form. In Persian, written in the Arabic script, with a large Arabic vocabulary, but still Persian, not Arabic. And this is followed by Turkish and Urdu and other languages. One can, for certain purposes, periodize by languages, yes, certainly.
Yes, we have the next to last question.
We are told that in the 9th, 10th century, Arabs and Jews were instrumental in translating many Greek ancient texts. And in this way, they were translated west through Spain. And that was one of the big feats of the Arab civilization. Somehow I find this kind of information at odds with what you have been saying of them not having any interest. At least at that time it seems to me that if they have been translating Aristotle and all these people, there must have been some interest for the Greek civilization. Or is that a wrong interpretation?
They were certainly very interested in what they regarded as useful. They knew that the ancient Greeks had reached a high level in medicine, in engineering, and a number of other useful practical sciences. And they therefore took steps to arrange for the translation of the relevant works into Arabic so that they could use them. On the other hand, they were not in the least bit interested in what they did not regard as useful. So, for example, they translated those works of Aristotle which they felt were useful, but they made no attempt to translate any of the ancient Greek historians or any of the ancient Greek literature. None of the poems, the epics, the plays, none of that is translated. None even of the historical narratives which you might expect would arouse some interest. And by the way, the translators were mostly Christians and Jews.
Professor Lewis' second lecture this year will be 2 weeks from now on January 21st, same time, same place, on choices for the Middle East.
In other words, I'll start where I left off.
In fact, I do have some questions, but I will ask over dinner.
Sure.